Libertarianism arose in America from distinctly American roots, yet in its soul it is a cosmopolitan philosophy celebrating a world united in spirit, ideas, and trade, while reveling in the wide panorama of freely chosen local peculiarity that only relatively free polities can provide. In other words, panarchism. Where is he quoting? I cannot pronounce his name. Etienne de la Boétie realized that government's control over us is ultimately ideological, that people believe they ought to obey the state before the state can command obedience. Interesting. Brainwashing first, then subservience. His insight helped drive modern libertarianism's mission to educate the public as to the true nature and effects of the state. Then it's quoting someone by the last name of Constant. Constant was one of the first liberal figures to see the state as always and everywhere the enemy, rather than a useful instrument for liberal reform against church, guild, and other power centers. In the view of this school of French economists, the relevant class distinction, as Franz Oppenheimer hinted, lay between the productive and the predatory. Just talking about their using Marx, but defining classes differently. With the productive being anyone working in the market in any capacity, and the predatory being the state and its agents and dependents who steal from the productive. Here we see the vital libertarian distinction between society and state, between the forces of productive human cooperation and those who prey on it, between, as Comte put it, farmers, manufacturers, merchants, and scientists, and courtiers, office holders, monks, permanent armies, pirates, and beggars. Following in this tradition was the greatest libertarian publicist of the 19th century, Frederick Bastiat. Says, in fact, the most popular book of libertarian economics in the 20th century, Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson, is a contemporary updating of Bastiat's style and approach to looking at the secondary and tertiary effects of government intervention. And it says, Bastiat composed the perfectly logical, on protectionist grounds, Candlemaker's Petition Against the Sun, arguing that for the benefit of French industry and craft, the nation must bar this dastardly source of free imported light. The most radical of the 19th century European liberal economists, and thus a particular favorite of Murray Rothbard's, was Gustave de Molinari. Molinari was the first, apparently, to explain how the principles and practices of the free competitive market could apply to military defense, thus kicking the props out from any need for government. Molinari hit on the most significant point anyone questioning the anarchy of the free market must understand, in the libertarian's view. How will this industry organize itself? What will be the operating techniques? Here is where political economy cannot know the answer. Also, I am able to affirm that if the need to feed itself is manifest at the heart of society, this need will be satisfied. Things will arrange themselves in absolutely the same manner if it is a matter of security rather than food. And that's what Molinari had said. The invisible hand. I pencil. Herbert Spencer was the most influential of the 19th century European philosophical radicals. He based his first major work of political philosophy, Social Statics, 1851, on what he saw as innate social laws that make liberty as essential to human life as understanding scientific laws is for mastering nature. This social law of liberty is so unyielding that it led Spencer to anarchism, announcing the right of the people to ignore the state. He later backslid from this anarchism and deleted that chapter from later editions of his book. I always like to know why people then abandon anarchism. And they didn't give an explanation here. They never gave an explanation for Roy Childs. In fact, Roy Childs refused to explain. Spencer was the most prominent name to drop when it came to a libertarian vision of unrestricted economic rights. Holmes had elsewhere written that no writer but Darwin had done more to shape the thinking of his age. Auberon Herbert, a disciple of Spencer's, stayed truer to Spencer's original anarchist vision and was a direct inspiration to a squad of 1950s American libertarian anarchists who adopted the term voluntarism. Herbert was that rare anarchist philosopher who was a practicing politician before his ideological maturation. He saw his anarchistic libertarianism as the final apotheosis of everything good in the human moral sense, a world in which force and violence can legitimately be used for nothing other than protecting self-ownership, the root of all human rights. An unjustly obscure figure in his style, and in the far places he took his libertarianism, Auberon Herbert sounds the most 20th century of all the 19th century individualists. I love him. That statement right there. I do think libertarianism is the next great moral leap. And then, coming further in American history, Brian Dougherty notes that the radicals consider the Constitution itself and the Federalist movement from which it arose a betrayal of America's tradition of decentralized liberty. I agree. This government never of itself furthered any enterprise, but by the alacrity with which it got out of the way. This is Henry David Thoreau, and it said Thoreau is famous for government is best when it governs least, but I like this other statement they attributed to him about the only way government furthers enterprise is to get out of the way. Says the linchpin of this American individualist anarchist movement was Benjamin Tucker, who blended the beliefs of his various American anarchist forebears and dedicated his life to a plumb line, no retreat, no sellout defense of them. And in comparing Rothbard with Tucker, they share a similar tone, a passionate belief in the moral illegitimacy of the state, and a brave, some might think foolhardy, tendency to remorselessly follow the logic of their chosen premises to any end, however bitter it might seem even to those who agreed most of the way. The modern libertarian movement is the only political tendency that honors these individualist anarchists, keeping their ideas alive and in some cases, like Lysander Spooner, openly embracing them. Despite this, not much contemporary scholarship analyzes the individualist anarchists in light of how their ideas have been revived and maintained by libertarianism. It says all of these ideas arose in a subterranean American environment of social ferment over free love, temperance, slavery, women's suffrage, and the liberty to speak and worship freely. And Brian Dougherty wryly notes, eventually everyone but the anarchists end up winning their beliefs. Goes on to Garrison, which says Garrison's life shows modern libertarians that uncompromising radicalism in defense of justice, even if most of your culture sees your cause initially as more madness than justice, can inflame souls and affect real change. Goes on now to talk about Josiah Warren, who didn't want to overthrow existing society. He merely wanted to create alternative communities where men could ignore the state. And it talks about some of these experiments, which ultimately failed. It says Tucker was certain who the primary enemy was, the state. is said by some to be a necessary evil. It must be made unnecessary, he declared. This century's battle then is with the state that debases man, the state that prostitutes women, the state that corrupts children, the state that trammels love, the state that stifles thought, the state that monopolizes land, the state that limits credit, the state that restricts exchange, the state that gives idle capital the power of increase, and through interest, rent, profits, and taxes, robs industrious labor of its products. Brian Dougherty also notes, history treats with more prominence the communistic anarchists it gives them more prominence than the more individualistic, individualism as opposed to communism. A lot of people, I think sometimes we have so normified the word communism that we forget it comes from communal, and it is actually the direct opposite of individualistic. It says a sign of the different ways history has treated the individualist anarchist versus the communist anarchist is how little known de Clara is compared to her occasional sparring partner, Emma Goldman. And Tucker believed a communist sailing under the flag of anarchism is as false a figure as could be invented. Don't conflate here, though, communism with socialism. Tucker considered himself a socialist, but thought communistic anarchism was just completely incoherent. It says Tucker moved in the radical socialist circles of his day and thought of himself as a socialist. He was aware that the quest for enforced equality leads to tyranny. And in his circle, there was Victor Yaros, was already defending anarcho-libertarians from the accusation that in opposing government, they oppose society and civilization. Yaros posited the anarcho-capitalist idea of competing defense agencies and a market replacing a government monopoly on defense. He said, society would cease to exist if life and liberty were not protected against invasion, external or internal, but it would not cease to exist if the governmental method were abandoned. Like libertarians often say, would we, if the government provided everyone shoes, think that the government would have to do that, or we would be barefoot? Now, here's what's interesting. It says, by the early 1890s, Tucker had discovered, and here I just radically disagree with Tucker here, a new foundation for his anarchism. He abandoned his initial belief in natural rights and embraced the egoism of German writer Max Stirner, as explained in The Ego and Its Own. There is no real liberty, save that one takes for oneself, Stirner declared. I'm seeing these battles even today with the people say, you don't have rights unless you can defend them. That's a Stirnerite right there, whether they realize it or not. Stirner rejected morality entirely. And I think you have to in order to believe that. But most people, I think, have cognitive dissonance there. Arguments based on rights struck him as superstitious hoodoo. To be truly free, the individual must be free of any mental spooks, as Stirner called them, that would become more important to him than him, full stop. Tucker came to insist, after Stirner, that contract alone creates obligations. Morality or rights has nothing to do with it. Liberty contributor John Kelly countered that contracts themselves posit a moral system, else whence came the obligation to obey them? And Tucker believed, as I do, and why I say the Libertarian Party is a social movement disguised as a political party, you have to educate the people first. Eliminating the state through revolution, without first convincing people that they don't need one, merely guarantees that another state will quickly arise in its place. Or as the Bible says, the end of that man is worse than the beginning. Tucker never promised a utopia, something the social agitators of his time seem to crave. There are some troubles from which mankind can never escape, he admitted. The anarchists have never claimed that liberty will bring perfection. They simply say that its results are vastly preferable to those that follow from authority. As a choice of blessings, liberty is the greater. As a choice of evils, liberty is the smaller. Then liberty always, says the anarchist, no use of force except against the invader. Amen. Now, I can't figure out, I'm going to need to look this up, and I can't do that here because I have no internet connection. Tucker moved to France, and then there was a backlash against anarchists. And I don't know whether this backlash was just in France or also in America. Like this sentence I'm going to read, I don't know where this applied geographically. Being an anarchist and an immigrant became a crime, and hundreds were arrested and dozens deported. The final act in the post-Haymarket drama of fear and distrust of anarchists. Was this just in France? I'm going to need to look that up. Then it moves into the badass himself, Lysander Spooner. And that's a badass first name too. Lysander. Spooner grew into his mature opinion that there was no legitimate authority behind the U.S. government or any government not based on complete consent, as the Declaration of Independence declares, doesn't it? He was especially caustic on the pretended consent in which the U.S. government cloaked itself, especially after the Civil War. The North exults beyond measure, he wrote, in the proof she has given that a government, professedly resting on consent, will expend more life and treasure in crushing dissent than any government openly founded on force has ever done. Irony of ironies. And it says, Garrison argued that to destroy the Constitution, basically. And it says, history was on Garrison's side as it took the destruction of aspects of the U.S. Constitution, particularly the idea that it was a voluntary... Okay, Wayne brought the dogs in. I kind of lost my spot. So I believe I was talking about where history favored Garrison's opinion because it took destruction of aspects of the U.S. Constitution, particularly the idea that it was a voluntary joining together of independent and sovereign states, and its official amendment to finally end slavery. True. And I didn't know Spooner's history with jury nullification. Spooner insisted that juries always had, and must always have, to protect citizens' liberties, the power to judge both the law and the facts. And I love this quote. It's an extended quote from Spooner. It says this quote is beloved by libertarians. I never heard it before, but I do beloved it now. The fact that the government, like a highwayman, says to a man, your money or your life. But the highwayman does not pretend that he has any rightful claim to your money, or that he intends to use it for your benefit. He has not acquired impudence enough to profess to be merely a protector. God bless you, the dog sneezing. Furthermore, having taken your money, he leaves you. He does not persist in following you on the road against your will, assuming to be your rightful sovereign on account of the protection he affords you. He does not keep protecting you by commanding you to bow down and serve him, by requiring you to do this and forbidding you to do that, by robbing you of more money as often as he finds it for his interest and pleasure to do so, and by branding you a rebel, a traitor, and shooting you down without mercy if you dispute his authority, or resist his demands. He is too much of a gentleman to be guilty of such impostures and insults and villainies as these. In short, he does not, in addition to robbing you, attempt to make you either his dupe or his slave. Woof! Goes back more to talking about Tucker, and Tucker's, I believe Tucker had Georgist sympathies. It says the Tucker, or at least the Tucker writes, they opposed absentee land ownership, and it says their belief, and they opposed the general libertarian belief in monetizing everything. And in close, as an author had said in a book about individual anarchists, the individual anarchists took the ideals of the liberal tradition more seriously than most Americans. This is also, and then Dougherty adds, this is also true of modern libertarianism. Now he goes on to talk about Albert J. Nock. Now I thought Nock was a minarchist. I could have sworn in Rothbard's article Towards a Radical Idealism, where he asked, do you hate the state, that he identified Nock as a minarchist. I could be mistaken, because here it says Nock was an anarchist. Now maybe this is why Rothbard said this, but I agree with Nock right here. Though he carefully distinguished the state, to which he is bloodily opposed, from government, the necessary functions for an orderly civilization historically usurped by the state. Absolutely agree with Nock. Maybe it was Nock that was the Georgist. I knew somebody in here got really into Henry George. It says, Nock wrote a long series of articles on the inequities of America's existing non-Georgist system of property taxation. I know a lot of people want me to cover Georgism, and I'm reluctant for several reasons. No offense to anyone here who might be a Georgist, because I think you'll admit this too, just like I like to admit that most libertarians are probably autistic. Georgists, I think, are the autistics of the autists. There are some Georgists where if you dispute their ideas or you don't agree, like, they don't stop. They will pursue you to the ends of the earth for debate and wear you down to a pulp. Some Georgists cannot brook any disagreement. And I'm sure you've noticed this kind of fanaticism. I personally do not, in any shape or form, hold to Georgism. I think it can lead to some very, very terrible results. Though, I also think there is a peculiar, and I mean this in a good way, heightened sense of justice and morality in the Georgists. So their motivations come from a very good place. So let's continue. Apparently Nock changed as he got older, as people do. Nock biographer makes much of the two Nocks, the early muckraking radical journalist with his innocent belief in the perfectibility of man and society, and the later Nock, who apparently got blackpilled, who, under the influence of largely forgotten architect and pop anthropologist Ralph Adams Cram, came to believe that the majority of people aren't human in any meaningful sense, and are beyond reform. And he was instrumental in the belief in the remnant. Now, I don't hold that kind of disgusting view of my fellow man, but I also am very sympathetic to the idea of the remnant, and I don't think it's because the majority of people aren't human or can't be educated. There are forces acting against that, and the time's just not right, and I do think there is a remnant that is keeping the spark of liberty alive. So it says the remnant belief is that the ideas of human liberty might not become dominant at any given historical moment, but that the movement's task is to keep the ideas alive, a flame of truth flickering in dark ages. I don't disagree with that. And it says it was through that idea that the foundation for that fee for economic education was born. It says Nock's most extended political thoughts are found in Our Enemy, the State, which I've never read, derived from a series of lectures he gave in the early 1930s at Columbia University. This is one of the few libertarian classics shot through with the thinking of Henry George. This is sometimes sold as a great introductory work to the libertarian tendency. It was introduced to me as such when I was a college student, but the book's focus, which attacks landlords and the evils of rent as per George, is almost as much as the state would strike most modern libertarians as somewhat strange. And I think for good reason. I'm not going to get into it now. I suppose at some point I will, and I just don't want to lose friends over this kind of debate. It says that Knock was he had a fussy bachelorhood that extended to believing that standard domestic family relationships were the enemy of the human race. Now, I have a streak of that myself, where I say I'm a radical deconstructionist. I am not at all of the conservative bent that we need to preserve the nuclear family, as if that is the bastion of liberty. I do not believe that. Knock was firmly opposed to the social pressure that might limit the freedom of alternative lifestyles. It wasn't enough, he insisted, for a judge to refuse to convict girls for walking naked down the street. True freedom would mean no one even noticed. He argued not merely for legal freedom, but for the necessity of an overarching spirit of liberal tolerance. You can't enforce that, but I agree. He hit on the idea, later also touched by Hayek, that a busybody state doing things both for and to its citizens damages a people's character. The best argument for free speech, Knock wrote, is what the suppression of it does to the character of people. Look what the fuck's happening today. He said, Rooseveltism, Hitlerism, Stalinism are all only local variants of the common doctrine that man has no natural rights, but only as are created for him by the state. And I guess Stirner would say, well, might makes right. That is, state absolutism formulated by German idealist philosophers. One of the most offensive things about FDR's America, Knock wrote, was its monstrous itch for changing people. Right, the government social engineering is gross. Knock's attitude toward effecting political change could be seen in something he once told Leonard Read, the founder of FEE, regarding his Georgism. He was not an advocate of the single tax. He was merely a believer in it. So he was very passive. He said, you think, write, informally teach, and then wait. Then the book progresses into how this turned into the new right, or the old right, which turned into the new right. It says the quality that united them was opposition to some, or most, of all of Roosevelt's New Deal, disdain for its quasi-fascist centralization, and disgust for his maneuverings of America into yet another European war. What links the old right to modern libertarian ideas was a call for a return to first principles, the U.S. Constitution, separation of powers, checks and balances, decentralization, limited popular rule, individual autonomy, in a word, republicanism. They were in some ways a new anti-federalist movement, as are modern libertarians. These movements are as American as whatever pie Americans gave up in order to choose apple. It says, we are a nation out to preserve our own political virtue, not expend citizens' lives and treasure trying to remold the world. Wish we had that lesson now. It says, now it's moving forward, Murray Rothbard, H.L. Mencken. It says, Murray Rothbard was correct, and noting that Mencken was first of all a radical individualist libertarian who believed in his own credo that all government is evil, and that all government must necessarily make war upon liberty, and that the democratic form is at least as bad as any of the other forms. I agree. And the average normie is shocked to hear that I despise democracy. And it gets into historical revisionism. And normally when you hear that term, it sounds bad. It sounds like somebody's trying to, like, what's that? There's revisionism going right now, the 1617 Project. But the way these libertarians in this book use the word revisionism says it refers to attempts to revise the standard triumphalistic understanding of our century's wars and their causes, which was spread by the victors. Basically, the victors writing the story. For instance, revisionist works that dealt with the Treaty of Versailles and its overly punitive measures that created the resentment and conditions that led to World War II. And I think that's, I've done research into that. There's a great book just called Versailles. It's quite obvious to me. But when it talks about the old rights end, it's because the ideas of Roosevelt won. It said Roosevelt and his forces won the war, and they won World War II. Those who opposed it were losers, and inevitably seen as sore ones at that. As modern libertarians recognize, America never really had an era of true laissez-faire, at least not since the Anti-Federalists lost their fight over ratifying the Constitution. Modern libertarianism is a vision of a radical and just future, but one whose contours are inherent in the meaning of the American Revolution, arising from European traditions of natural law, natural rights, a relationship between man and the state that ought to be contractual and reciprocal, and a vision of man that is rooted in the best of the Western Christian tradition. Absolutely. So we oversimplify things when we talk about early American history being purely libertarian or mostly libertarian. No, the contours were there. Large contours. But we went astray. That's it for chapter 1. I'm looking forward to chapter 2. What was the title again? Just so we know what we're looking forward to. I'm learning a lot. I hope you are. Austrian roadblocks on the road to serfdom. And I forgot how we described what chapter 2 would do. So I'm going back to the introduction where he said, okay, chapter 2 will discuss the early careers and radical free market economics of the Austrian school. Okay, sounds good. Talk at you then.